Please welcome
Morning.
It's good to see everybody this morning. Today I'm joined by the Director of the Cybersecurity and Information Security or Infrastructure Security Agency. I knew I'd get it wrong one of these days. I got it right 100 times in a row,
long
but it's a
name,
tongue
actually.
twister actually, and I didn't practice. Normally I start out by going cyber to loosen up my lips. But anyway, thank you for joining us today,
Yeah,
Jen.
my pleasure. Always great to be with you.
So I was told that I wasn't allowed to open up with what's happening and then just sit back and wait for 30 minutes to see what's happening. But I do want, for the folks that are kind of new to cybersecurity or for the folks that haven't heard you speak before, can you describe the role of CISA, what it is and what your mission is?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great to be here with you. Thank you. So Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We love security so much, we had to have it twice in our name.
I think you could add it a third time if you got it covered.
We could try,
That's why I'm going to do marketing in my next career.
That's the way we call it, CISA. There's always a debate about is it CISA or CISA or CISA, so CISA is the correct pronunciation. So we were stood up, we're the newest agency in the federal government. We were stood up almost 4 years ago. Our 4th birthday is coming up. And our mission is to lead the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. And when we talk about critical infrastructure, sometimes people's eyes glaze over and they're like, oh, infrastructure, that's the IT people thing.
I'm perking up right now, for the record.
But critical infrastructure, as you know, is really just the networks and the systems and the data that we all rely upon that underpin the critical functions, like how we get gas at the pump, how we get food at the grocery store, how we get money from the ATM, our power, our water, our transportation, our healthcare. And so protecting and defending those systems is really why CISA was stood up. Now, of course, we know that those systems are largely owned and operated by the private sector. That's why, as a largely voluntary agency, we have an enormous responsibility to build trusted partnerships so that we can work together for collective defense, and I know we're going to talk more about that. But that's why we were stood up, really to be America's cyber defense agency, and that's how we're evolving and building.
So we might as well jump right into it then. There were steps taken to help bring the private and public sector together because it's obvious that we have to have a collaborative defense. Can you talk about the JCDC? I'm not even going to try to get that acronym out there. I learned my lesson already.
Yes, so JCDC, Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative.
I would have nailed it.
It was an idea that was brought to fruition by the Cyberspace Solarium Commission a couple years ago. It was actually started out being called the Joint Cyber Planning Office, which I thought was a terrible acronym, JICPO. It sounded a little bit like a disease of some sort.
Doesn't sound like a rock band. That's
no,
why.
It does not. Yeah. And so Kevin and I share a love for rock music. In fact, we're going to come out here and play some electric guitar riffs.
Yes.
But we're going to save that for our
Well,
RSA.
when I invited Jen, hey, do you want to speak at mWISE? She was like the Mandiant, wild, insane sound exposition. Let's rock it. And I just went, no, it's not that. And I know you're eager for that. But anyway, it's not the wild, insane sonic exploration conference.
It actually should be the sonic exploration.
Year.
I like it. So, we were going to call it the Advanced Cyber Defense Collaborative, but the lawyers didn't like that. So we called it the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. But really, the importance of it is it's the only entity that in law actually brings together the whole federal cyber ecosystem. So CISA, NSA, FBI, Cybercom, Defense, Justice, Director of National Intelligence, Secret Service, and the National Cyber Director, all on one platform focused on cyber defense planning and operations. And so you have one place you can go to in the federal government for cyber defense, and then we build those collaborative relationships with the private sector and with state and local and with international partners so that we can put the pieces of the threat environment together, we can connect them to drive down risk at scale. And one of the early things that we did was develop what we call the JCDC Alliance, which are the 20-ish, 25 biggest technology companies. So think ISPs, CSPs, infrastructure companies, cybersecurity vendors. Why? Because everything critical infrastructure is underpinned by technology. And so those technology companies often are the first point where you see bits and pieces of that threat environment, right? What you saw in FireEye during SolarWinds. And so with that information shared collaboratively, we can enrich it with what we see in the .gov, what we get from state and local, what our international partners are seeing, and what the intelligence community sees. And if we can put that picture together in a really unprecedented way, I think we have a real-time sharing ability to develop an awareness that we've never had before. You know, partnerships to date and the sharing, I think was, and I certainly saw this from the private sector when I was at Morgan Stanley, was much more ad hoc and episodic. You know, the relationship with the government was about, you go to the FBI field office, you know, once a month, and you get a threat briefing. And so what we're trying to do is have this real-time, continuous, what I call persistent collaboration. You know, our good friend Paul Nakasone talks about persistent engagement with the adversary on networks overseas. We're really focused on the flip side of that, which is persistent collaboration with all of our stakeholders to put that picture together of what we're seeing that could potentially introduce risk to our critical infrastructure.
And so I'm going to elaborate for 20 seconds. Jen can sip her coffee. You know, when I look at the JCDC, I do think it's made some changes, and we'll get to the specifics on Log4j, and I think Ukraine would be a good one too. And as you do your Hall's cough drop, I'll continue to talk. And I look at the roles of like CrowdStrike or Symantec or Cisco or Mandiant or anyone in cybersecurity. One of the first things we've got to do is, if we see new and novel attacks, is we can't think of it as intellectual property anymore. We have to think of it as, how do we do shields up with that? And that's what I feel Mandiant does. That's why we respond to every breach that matters and have you know, global threat intelligence. And we're going to take that to the JCDC when we find new and novel, because inside of that is the means to communicate and scale the defenses for that new and novel. Yeah. So we might as well get to specifics then. And I think it's ironic that the first time that I sat at a meeting with you, I think Log4j came out, it was like December.
The same day, December 10th. That was our first
whatever.
board meeting.
I was off by 2 days.
Exactly.
Yeah, so let's go to Log4j, because a lot of people talk about it, but so what did we do about it? Why wasn't it like a huge problem for everybody?
Yeah. So it's really interesting, right? I mean, we stood at the JCDC in August, and that was our first opportunity really to operationalize what we were trying to build, which is, you know, essentially we wanted to see the dots, connect the dots, drive down risk at scale. And so when we first got word of Log4j, I think it was December 9th or December 10th, we really activated those connections that we had made with the technology companies and with the federal government, and immediately started bringing everybody together so we could understand the vulnerability itself, but where it was, because we know it was so ubiquitous, it was easy to exploit, and that's why we were really worried about how it could be used by threat actors in pretty nefarious ways. And so bringing that community together, we really tapped into the research community, which I think is fantastic, and we've been leaning into developing close partnerships with researchers so that we can take advantage of all the work that we're doing through our coordinated vulnerability disclosure platform. But I think in the very quick work and the urgency, and you and I were talking about this on the phone right after the news broke, we were able to bring together the information. We were able to have basically a one-stop shop source of authority, a GitHub where people could actually go and see, where are these products that might be vulnerable, what do I need to do to reduce risk? And I think for the first time in a while, we were really able to get ahead of the threat and help to drive down risk through the guidance we were putting out, through the mitigations, through the patching. And so I think that was an early success story in how the community can work together on a really hard problem. And, you know, as you and I have talked about, we haven't seen, you know, we've seen exploitation, but we haven't seen the massive exploitation that we expected. I think some of this is really the urgency that we were able to motivate, both on the private sector side, on the researcher side, on the government side. And then the fact that we did go shields up and were able to do everything we could to patch and mitigate. And that was, you know, a good dress rehearsal, frankly, for what came about a month later, which we started to prepare for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We were working on that actually probably around the same time. You remember we gave a briefing to the board members But we were reaching out to all of the critical infrastructure sectors, us and the Intel community, to at all levels of classification, to talk to them about the threat, what we saw as potential with respect to the invasion, what we knew about the Russians from the very clear playbook on malicious cyber activity, and then importantly, all of the things that folks needed to do to be able to mitigate risk on their network. And that's really where we started the Shields Up campaign that we're continuing to this date. And if you go to the webpage on CISA, it's really an understanding of the threat, but also what do you do if you're a CEO, if you're a security team, if you're an American who wants to know, hey, am I vulnerable and how do I protect myself, or a small and medium or large business. And so that type of guidance, I think, really helped to rally the community in a way that, you should tell me, because you've been doing this for a long time as well, that I think we first, in a long time, in a very proactive way, because we're always so reactive. And what we're really trying to do is get ahead of the planning, get ahead of the understanding, and get ahead of the mitigation, and all of that is about resilience.
So, have a halls or?
I got it.
So how did it work? Like, I remember right around the time of the invasion into Ukraine, our people were on a Slack channel with your folks and other members of the JCDC, and we had shared indicators with all the security vendors at that point. So whether you knew it or not, Palo Alto Networks, CrowdStrike, Symantec, Microsoft, Google, everybody was doing Shields Up already against the TTPs that we were most worried would be deployed. And that's it. So in a way, to me, the JCDC was a way to get the private sector to share, because prior to that, if I saw something new and novel and went, hey, we need to get the community to do something, I'd be, hey, Nikesh, we found something.
Right.
I'd call him at Penn, and I'd get on the phone with George and go, hey, George, I think we got a problem. That didn't scale well, and after about 5 phone calls, I'd tap out anyway. So bottom line, it's great to be able to say, hey, put that in the channel, and it's going to go to the vendors that can do Shields Up, even because if we tell every company, all you're going to do is turn to, hey, what do we use as our firewall? What do we use for app security? What do we use on our endpoint? And you're going to want to know if the vendors are ready to protect you. This, in my opinion, the private-to-private sharing actually got faster just by forming the JCDC.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I always joke around the exotic tool called Slack that for the first time was able to bring together the private sector and the public sector. But I mean, it is super interesting when you think about it, because all of that sharing then goes into the products that we've been putting out that you see in the advisories or the threat products that typically are now almost all multi-sealed. I'm really happy about that as well, because I think it's very important that we send a coherent signal from the US government. So typically you'll see NSA, FBI, and CISA. Sometimes we'll bring in other agencies, we'll bring in international partners, but all of that is enriched by what we are sharing and what are we getting from industry. And so I think that ability to share in a much more responsive and transparent way, I think can really shift the paradigm. We talk so much about threats and how we're so worried about this very complex and dynamic cyber threat environment, nation state actors, cyber criminals. But I think it sometimes downplays the fact that as defenders, we have enormous power if we can work together collaboratively, and if we each take accountability and responsibility for our ability to defend cyberspace. And I think Chris might have talked a little bit about that. Those are some themes that are consonant in the National Cyber Strategy. But it's all about how do we work together to enrich the threat picture so that we can do something about it proactively.
So let's get tactical then, because I know we've learned some lessons in Ukraine. You're going there already on that.
Yeah.
If we focus on defense, we can actually be resilient enough to start winning. And I do feel that shift change. We had Phil Venables on stage, I guess 2 or 3 days ago, and he said, I'm a near-term pessimist, long-term optimist. And he said pessimist because of the hybrid networks with old tech and how hard it is to secure it. I'm going to say I'm a near-term pessimist to the extent that we have challenges securing ourselves, but I'm a mid-term optimist in that we actually know what's coming next. I mean, anyone who's a prognosticator of the threats is going to say the same thing this year that they would have said last year. And I think we're almost going through a time frame where everybody believes it. Okay, there's going to be destructive attacks. There's going to be attacks on critical infrastructure. But I also think there's a doctrine that's keeping some of the new and novel out of the theater of attacking those places right now. Because nobody wants to see the conflict in Ukraine escalate right now. Maybe we're boiling frogs and we just don't see it. So we're afforded some time right now to do a Shields Up. So let's dive into that. What is your agency doing to, and I saw the White House just release something, and I'll get it wrong. It sounded like they were saying we're going to protect critical infrastructure, and they had a policy on healthcare, water, and then something else.
Yeah.
But that, I mean, it's right in your venue. When I read it, I was like,
Absolutely.
that's what you guys are chartered to protect. So what are we doing to protect that?
So look, at the end of the day, it's, critical infrastructure, 16 sectors, subsectors. We sit sort of in the center of it.
Right.
By law, we were set up to be the national coordinator for critical infrastructure resilience and security, and that's really a recognition that even if one sector has invested billions of dollars in technology and people and process, like we did in finance when I was at Morgan Stanley, if the power is not working, if the telecommunication systems are not
Nothing's working,
you're not going to really get very far. And so we have to think of this as critical functions, not just critical sectors. And so we need to work across all of the sectors and connect them and make sure that we are reducing risk to all of the critical functions that drive our daily lives. And so we work very closely with what's called the sector risk management agencies. So for the defense industrial base, it's DoD and NSA, and I know our friend Rob was here earlier in the week. For the healthcare sector, it's Health and Human Services. For water, it's EPA. But we're essentially every day working with all of these entities, and then with the private sector, putting out guidance, providing resources, in some cases providing no-cost services. Some of those no-cost services, by the way, came from our JCDC private sector partners to try and raise the bar for the small and medium businesses as part of the Shields Up campaign. And so I think that, and you do a bunch of pro bono stuff as well, which I think is fantastic, because there are among many of these sectors what we call the target-rich, resource-poor entities, like some of the small water facilities, like some of the nonprofit hospitals, like the K through 12 school districts. All of those things are part of critical infrastructure, but they don't have large security teams. They're not investing millions and billions of dollars like some in finance and energy are. And so we have to figure out how to connect all of these entities together in a way that we can get information out that is useful to them, that is tailored to their ability to understand it and absorb it, and then to drive down risks to all of our national critical functions. And so through the Shields Up campaign, but really on a daily basis through what's called the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council, where we work with all of the sectors, through things like the JCDC, through the Cybersecurity Advisory Committee that we stood up, through the Technical Advisory Council, where we work with researchers under Jeff Moss's leadership, through like the Cyber Safety Review Board, which is public and private, and looked at Log4j and made a determination about lessons learned, which I thought was hugely important for us to do. And even things like the Joint Ransomware Task Force. And so to the point you just raised, where we're gonna focus over the next year is on 3 of those target-rich, resource-poor sectors, specifically water, hospitals, and K through 12.
Oh, it's K
through 12 schools. I mean, we saw LA Unified School District recently hit with ransomware, and I think that was actually really interesting as a case study when we think about the cyber incident reporting legislation, because one of the things that the school district did is it reached out to FBI and to CISA. We were working with them very early on, and they were very transparent. They did a press conference, similar to what you did with SolarWinds. They did a press conference. They said, this is what we know, and this is what we're going to do about it, and we're going to keep you informed. And that transparency really raises the bar and raises all boats. When you understand what the threat is, you can prepare yourself. It's like in a neighborhood, you'd want to know if your neighbor got robbed, because you're going to put your shields up and you're going to create, you're going to be on guard and have that level of vigilance. And that's really where the country needs to be. I think Katie Nichols earlier in the week mentioned that, shields up forever. Which I think Shields Up, the whole campaign has brought us to, a higher level. And I do think it's the new normal, but I don't think that we can have our incident responders and our SOC folks, on call 24 hours a day. I think we need to worry about the health and really the mental health of our community. And so what we're looking at, I think you're actually helping us with this, is how do we think about being more targeted in terms of the threat by sector, by region, so that we can calibrate at what level people need to have that level of vigilance and give actual guidance on how to mitigate and reduce risk.
It sounds like cybersecurity performance goals would be awesome.
Yes, I think so too. Well, look, so what Kevin's talking about, we were asked by the White House last year to work with NIST on the development of cybersecurity performance goals. And what these are, it really starts from the point of the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a great comprehensive guide to how you put in place a risk management program. And if you're a big business, you can align yourself with your big security team to the NIST cybersecurity framework. But if you're a small and medium business, you don't have the resources to be able to implement everything across that framework. And so what we did is work with NIST to determine the most high impact, high risk areas, and there's really 35 of them. That was the starting cross-sector baseline for performance. Those high impact, high risk areas where you can put controls in place to drive down risk. And so we're going to be releasing those next week, and I'm really excited about them because for the first time, I think we're going to be able to materially measure the reduction of risk across the most critical areas. And it comes with, you and I are big fans of checklists.
Yes,
so it comes with a checklist that says, here's how we've done it, here's we're in progress, we've completed it. And we've also sort of coded it by what's the most high impact, and what's the cost, and what's the complexity. And so, I can't take any credit for it. Eric Goldstein, our head of cyber, and his fantastic team worked on this with our NIST colleagues, but got a massive amount of feedback from the private sector. And I think, and we're going to continue to iterate, by the way, and get feedback, but I think it can make a really material difference because we're always searching for that holy grail. How do you measure reduction of risk, right? But you've seen them. I don't know, what do you think?
So I can tell you, every time I'm sitting with a board, their top question is, how good are we? Every time you talk to a resource-constrained head of security somewhere, they're like, help me prioritize the 400 things I need to do. And one of the ways we'd prioritize is say, hey, let's red team your network, see if we can break in using common techniques, and then help you prioritize so you can stop those threats. But what you did, and I'm a big fan of this, is there's nothing wrong with a comprehensive standard, except that it's comprehensive. It gives you hundreds of things to do. What you did is said, hey, for access management, here's a few things to do. For device management, here's a few things. For vulnerability, here's a few things. For supply chain, there was 3 things. And
did you memorize this? It's pretty good. Yeah.
Yes,
fantastic.
Read the book. And then for response and recovery, there's a few things. And for data security, there's a few things. So what they did is just said, if you do these, and I know, more than a password.
You love it, right?
The amount of times that we've said as consultants to a lot of companies, if all you do is make sure you have multi-factor authentication for everything you possibly can, both inside use, external coming in, you raise your defenses dramatically, and I think that's what this checklist did. And by the way, the checklist is in color, which is really cool. It's like greens and reds, so it literally helps, So thank you for the color.
Yeah, well, thank you for your
big
feedback
fan
on
of
it.
that.
Can I hit the more than a password for a second?
What's that? Please do.
Do you play any Boston, by the way?
Oh my goodness, yes, I can play that.
A little bit of Boston. Yes. Because I think it's worth pausing on the fact that it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month.
It is.
Right?
It's also Halloween, though.
It is Halloween.
I guess cybersecurity is as important as Halloween.
And I think every month should be Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Although we've all enjoyed, everybody that follows Rob Joyce on Twitter, we've all enjoyed his cyber memes. But I think this whole more than a password thing is really important when you think about the simple things that Americans can do, like multi-factor authentication for something so important. Terrible name for it, so that's why we went with the whole more than a password. But one thing that we did earlier this week, Bob Lord, who you know, and I both spoke at Authenticate, which is the FIDO Alliance conference that we have. and various flavors of MFA, right? I mean, we say MFA is better than no MFA, but really the gold standard is FIDO. And one of the things that we talked about, and folks will see it on a blog that we put out earlier this week, is really calling for radical transparency on the technology vendors with respect to implementation of multi-factor authentication, type of multi-factor authentication, SMS or FIDO, how many of your system administrators have implemented multi-factor authentication, because I think getting a much better understanding of that technology ecosystem will also help to do sort of the nudging that enables us to be safer, as critical infrastructure is all underpinned by technology. But I did want to mention, as we think about what we're going to be talking about in the coming year with all of our partners across the federal government, this idea of call to action for technology vendors to be much more focused on secure by default, so enablement of MFA, secure logging, no SSO tax, things like that, where you actually have security baked in, so we don't have to say implement MFA anymore. But also security by design. We have accepted this strange cultural norm where software and technology comes off the line just rife with vulnerabilities. And I think we need to expect more and really demand more from our technology providers. And there are many of our colleagues and friends that are big advocates of this in the technology world. Many are in the JCDC Alliance. But at the end of the day, we are in this strange place where we have put the burden on the least capable and the least knowledgeable about the threat to defend themselves, as opposed to the technology providers creating technology that's much more secure by design. So, I think that's really important. Everybody has a role. I'm sure Chris Inglis talked about this. Everybody has a role in cyber. The government has a clear role. The private sector has a role. Americans have a role. But the key is we all have to work together and recognize that we're all individually and collectively accountable for keeping America safe.
The shame of that is, if you're wildly successful, what will we do on Patch Tuesday?
Yeah, I know. We can
everybody looks forward to
eradicate Patch Tuesday.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be awesome?
Or the statistics of, I try to patch my critical systems in under 2 weeks. Is that good? And my answer is always, I don't know.
Yeah.
Is 2 weeks good?
Well, that's the other thing.
Could
To your point about resources, one of the other things Eric and team did was to develop the known exploited vulnerabilities list.
Right.
And so that's all about prioritization. There's so many vulnerabilities. Which are the ones that we know are actively exploited by threat actors, so that you can actually prioritize those. So, resources and prioritization, to your earlier question, I think that's one place where we're really trying to add value. And that's the whole paradigm that we're trying to implement here. You say the old trope about we're from the government, we're here to help, and everybody's eyes roll over and you're being sarcastic. But we really recognize that we play a role, but it's a role that is more of an enabler, because we can enrich information, we can do incident response, we do hunt, we do vulnerability management. But private sector has such visibility into the threat environment. We need to approach this as a total team sport. We need to approach it with transparency, with a degree of humility and a lot of gratitude. And I think that attitude has helped us sort of shift the momentum in people saying, oh, the government actually does want to help.
Absolutely. Well, and Chris, I've got 2 more questions for you. I'm going to jam them in. Chris Inglis said he's kind of the coach, you're the quarterback, and I said, and I'm the water boy. And can you elaborate on that just briefly? And then I have 3 important questions after that. So.
This was an analogy actually early on.
Yes.
When Chris was going through his, we went through confirmation together, and there's a lot of question about what is this national cyber director, and I don't know if we're the quarterback. In that, we are the national coordinator for critical infrastructure resilience and security, and we play a role as America's cyber defense agency. We're the defenders.
Yeah, you're the
and
defensive
so
line.
We're probably a little bit more the defensive line than the quarterback. But
totally.
But what I love is that Chris is a great coach.
Right.
Being a great coach is hard. Coaches make people better, and I think Chris is the type of person that makes everybody better who he works with and collaborates with. He's collaborative to the core, and I think he has added tremendous value in terms of standing up this new capability that's helped to create coherence across the federal cyber ecosystem. So definitely a great coach.
So we have to address this, so we're going to ignore the counter for a little bit. Election security. I know your agency is heavily involved in that. We're heavily involved with Ron Bouchard and his folks and Sandra Joyce and her folks. How are we bracing for yet another election and the security risks that come with that?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for your work. Where also the JCDC is doing election security focus as well. So, I've said this on the record, and it's something that I wake up every morning and think about. This threat environment in 2022 is the most complex we've ever seen in an election year. And we're continued to be concerned about cyber threats, both from nation state actors or things like ransomware. There's insider threats that we're concerned about. There's physical threats, which is really unfortunate when you think about threats of harassment against election officials that are on the front lines, that are basically there to protect democracy. And then you think about the threats of misinformation and disinformation. And I know the threat panel that John and Katie and company talked a lot about this. And so our role as a sector risk management agency is to ensure that state and local election officials across the country have the resources and the tools and the capabilities and the intelligence and the information that they need to run safe and secure elections. And I think since critical infrastructure was designated, since election infrastructure was designated as critical infrastructure in 2017, we have come a long way. And I continue to give incredible credit to my predecessor, Chris Krebs, and people like Matt Masterson, who developed these incredible partnerships with all of the state and local election officials who started out very skeptical of the federal government trying to get involved in that mission. And we have continued with that. We brought in a great senior election security leader, former Secretary of State Kim Wyman, and Jeff Halen, our team. But as much as I'm concerned about the threat environment, and we continue to put out information, we had a couple advisories that we did with FBI focused on, the potential for disruption and also about the use of misinformation or disinformation. Yesterday, we put out a product on various tactics of disinformation and how to build resilience against them. I actually think that Americans should go to the ballot box with confidence. There's been an incredible amount of work done across the board to be able to secure our election infrastructure. And so I want to make sure that Americans do have that confidence in the integrity of that election infrastructure. And to know that there are really hundreds of thousands of people across the government, within the private sector, at the state and local level, who are working day in and day out to ensure that those elections will be secure, will be resilient. And so it's an incredible mission because, frankly, getting to work with state and local election officials who are some of the most hardworking civil servants and really doing everything we can to empower them as the trusted voices in their communities for all matters of election. It's a real privilege as somebody who served in the military, and you were in the Air Force, I was in the Army. I mean, these are the foundations of our democracy, and so it's a privilege to be part of that mission.
And with that, no better way to end, and we can vote with confidence, and we have thousands of people on the front lines actively looking for influence operations and making all of us have the tools we need to spot them, be aware of them, and ignore them. So with that, please join me in thanking Director Jenny.